I just wanted to start off the afternoon to say again on behalf of everybody who's been involved in organising this, to say thank you very much for coming, and it's really great to see such a wide spectrum of people, both north and south, involved today. So when I was thinking about the afternoon, and I didn't get any option as to whether I do the morning or the afternoon, Sean did try and tell me I had the better of it, but I'm not so sure. In any event, what I did learn this morning was that I should think about the three houses. So I'll tell you what my worries are. It's already started, actually, that the afternoon attendance would be down and people wouldn't show up on time. It's the graveyard shift, and the lunch will have been too good a lunch. So I said to myself, well, what are the strengths? I said, well, somebody has a bell, I know that. You're all here, and you have come back, thank you for that. And I know we have some more excellent speakers. So my hopes and dreams are you'll stay till the end. And I suppose much more importantly, we will have had a really good exchange of knowledge, and that we will have connected, and I suppose many people reconnected as a network for ongoing and future collaboration. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Nora Gibbons. And Nora needs very little introduction, either north or south. She worked for many years in social work in both the statutory and voluntary sector in the UK and in Ireland, and known to us in the south, principally for the work she did as Director of Advocacy in Barnardo's, and also the work she did on a number of inquiries, not least the co-chairing the Independent Child Death Review Group. She's also works as a member of the Historical Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland, which began in 2012, and has recently been appointed as the first chairman of the board of the new Child and Family Agency in the South. So thank you, Nora.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, folks. I think we should just have finished with the presentations by Karen and Patricia, because for me they were absolutely excellent, and they showed us what two determined social workers heading up determined social work teams in the statutory sector could do and can do to turn around situations which, as they described, were fairly difficult, both for the staff and for children and families in their areas. But despite that, I have to do something. So what I've agreed with Liz, that because of the time, I'm going to slash and burn a little bit in my presentation, so I hope it's not too disjointed because of that. I do have it available and we'll pass it on, so references and things will be available to people. A lot of the challenges that arose from different reviews were outlined this morning. Just briefly to say to you that while I am speaking both as a practicing social worker, somebody who's managed social work teams, etc., etc., obviously I'm speaking a lot from the work I have done in various reviews, both historical and more recent. But of course, nothing I say today arises out of the Historical Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland, which is ongoing and which will in time report. I see really in the development of the new Child and Family Agency in the Republic, which is the process of being established as referenced this morning and many times, I see that as a real opportunity. And the formation of it has been coming for some time, but was absolutely identified that children and families and child welfare and protection, and particularly areas around early intervention, did not prosper within a very wide-based health services executive, because the issues facing the board of that executive, facing the CEO, were largely to do with the cost of medicines, waiting lists, A&Es, how ambulances got produced, not very much to do with the kind of day-to-day work that many of us here face. I have had an opportunity to review some 196 cases, paper reviews, desk reviews, going through their files with my colleague Dr. Jeffrey Shannon, looking at practice, not in the ancient past, largely during the 90s, and more recently from 2000 to 2010. For those of you who are unaware of that report, it covered children both who died while they were in the care of the state, both natural and unnatural causes. It also covered children who were in aftercare, not necessarily receiving an aftercare service because we didn't have a very developed one. And it also looked at the cases of children who were known to the services for a period of time. So it covered a wide range of children, aged 0 to, I think, the oldest child was possibly 20. And I also chaired a review looking at, I suppose, what would be a serious case incident, a family case with 6 children that were known to the services for some 14 years, and where both parents were convicted of serious sexual abuse of their children, but where the underlying issues were around neglect for many years. So it's coming from there, and also coming from my own experience in social work and advocacy, that I speak with you. It's of interest to me because I was looking at practice in the 1990s and 2000 and upwards, that in the 1990s we had a real injection of resources into child welfare and protection systems in the Republic. That was based on, for those of you who will know it, the famous Kilkenny case. For those of you who don't, it was a review carried out by one of our judges into a very, very serious case where there had been abuse of one of the children, serious level of sexual abuse over many years. As in the Roscommon case, some of this was known into the community to people who should have been focused on child protection, but who focused, maybe as discussed this morning, more on the families and on a belief system that the children should stay within the family regardless. I don't mean that to sound harsh. I don't mean that people thought regardless of what happened to the children, but that the whole question, which is a very valid place to come from, of trying to keep children and trying to keep them safe within their family. At that time, as an advocate going in to talk to government ministers and to government officials, very much it was seen that childcare was fixed. And I think that that reminds all of us that money alone does not solve the problems, and that fixing any problem, particularly those where we are dealing with human nature, is an ongoing task and requires our constant vigilance. We also had outlined this morning for us, and we understand that many of the children involved here, many of the children and families we are concerned about, are faced with multiple difficulties. It's not just one problem, it never is. And particularly arising from the child death reviews, and indeed in the Roscommon case, the issues of alcoholism, of addiction to one substance or another, domestic violence and poverty would have featured very high on the list of problems being faced. I'm just going to look at 2 issues that arose, because there's so many of them you could have taken. And could I just say that in the child deaths review, as in other reviews that Helen referred to, we looked and outlined good practice every place that we could find it. There is as much to be learned from the cases where it was natural death. Now, we didn't publish those because of our terms of reference, as there was to looking at cases where there was unnatural deaths. So anywhere we found good practice, and we did find it. In some cases, sadly, I couldn't reference it. I couldn't, from my experience as a social worker, reference good practice. And that is not an easy thing for a social worker to say. The 2 things that I want to just focus on a little bit, and I'm cutting out lots of my paper because it was dealt with this morning, but the full paper will be published. One of the key things for me as a social worker was the absence of the voice of the child. And in discussing this with some practitioners, as we had the opportunity to do, but they weren't all full reviews, so we didn't meet everybody. I didn't meet, and I don't know of any practitioners who deliberately set out to exclude the child from their work, or indeed not to listen to children. And it may well be that many had in fact spoken to children. They just did not record it. I, like our first contributor this morning, had learned my social work trade, and I do call it a trade as well as a profession, way back in the 1970s. And if I had come back from a family visit without seeing a child, I would be sent straight back out again. So I suppose it is a lesson that I learned very much, both from training and from on practice. So if children were seen, their voices were not recorded. And I was delighted again to hear in the presentation directly before lunch of case files now and supervision records, keeping a note of what did you see this child, did you talk to the child, and more importantly, what are the child's wishes? What has the child got to say? I was also very struck this morning about the whole concept of asking workers to walk in the shoes of children. What would it have felt like for that child in that family? We did that in one of the reviews that I was part of. And can I say, and I understood it, and I felt it myself, workers who had worked with that family found that a very difficult question. a very difficult question. These were children where neglect had been a feature of their lives for many years, where because of that neglect, their presentation within their community was less than what we would want for all of our own children. And so life was very difficult for them. And they did talk about that when they came into the care system. And they were well served by the same social workers when they were in the care system. But that was a very difficult thing to ask people to consider what might it have been like for those children. So it is a difficult question to think about it. And when I was trying to think about why, what happens that social workers and other workers indeed do not hear the voices of children, do not take the time, it's not because they don't want to. I'm not absolutely sure about what it is. After listening to Helen this morning, I daren't suggest that they need more training, but I certainly won't be suggesting that the third level institutions should give it. I would think after listening to Karen and Patricia that the on-the-site training, the training as you do, and the reminding of key concepts that I know are taught in social work cases. For example, in one instance, clearly issues around attachment and bonding that jumped off the pages of the reviewers were not immediately evident or were misinterpreted to the very highly qualified social workers and committed social workers who were working with the family. But something needs to happen to keep the training that we've all got, to keep it alive for us, to make it real for us, and to make sure that when we go out there to practice, particularly as newly qualified social workers, that we don't lose sight of it. And I would remind us that social work is one of the few professions where you get qualified and you're out, and you have the title social worker, and that's a great day, but it also means that you go into offices where perhaps too much is expected, and where, as we saw in many cases, the most difficult cases were handed on. And certainly my second point, again it was spoken about this morning, was the lack of supervision. If there was supervision, it was not recorded. The supervision in relation to this particular child and this particular case was not on the child's records. And we were not provided with records that would show that the person had received supervision. And I think supervision is more about, it's not about, for me, it's not about ticking boxes. Although some boxes require to be ticked, but that's not what it's about. It's about an opportunity to reflect, to do maybe the three houses, to say, look, what's going well here? What are my concerns about this case? And what do we want to happen here? And to go back and to review that. And again, all I could see in many of the case files that I reviewed, and 197 is quite a big number. You can't just say, oh, that there isn't learning out of that. There is. And it was across a recent period of time in our social work practice. But too often we saw, or what we were reading about, looked like you had a social worker marooned with a very difficult and complex situation. Now, I know from being in and from being part of social work offices that there is a lot of support for colleagues in social work offices, often maybe not necessarily coming from the team leader, maybe from other colleagues. And certainly I think when I was practicing first, I really valued my supervision sessions, but I also valued being able to come back and talk to colleagues and say, look, I've just seen, what do you think? Where else should I go? What else might be available? So I think you need both of those. But I would like to see a much more emphasis on the ongoing training for social workers. We're one of the few professions who gets their qualification and are sent out there. Others have extended periods of training on the job available to them before they can take the badge of being fully qualified. And I think, in view of the work that we do, perhaps that's something that should be further considered. Now let me see where I've got to in cutting down this. I was delighted, and I'm delighted to support the move away from too much by the way of guidelines, or as I understand the new language to be, guidance. I think the recent one, and Helen referred to it this morning again, the recent guidance produced here on Children First is an excellent piece of work because it's very clear. You cannot tell social workers, first you do A, and then you do B, and then you do C. No profession, I think, could manage if that's the way we expected them to work. There has to be place for, and Mary Connolly referred to it this morning, for informed professional judgments. And while it is important, but I want to see those informed professional judgments, I want to see them recorded. Because another issue that was very clear at all the case files we found was to look at where is the decision making, who's making them, and what are the reasons for it. One of the case files in particular had a huge number of case conferences around a group of children. What I could say is that much of the information that was brought to the case conference was cut and pasted from previous case conferences. And at the end of this case, before action finally had to be taken, the same set of recommendations that was made at the first case conference was made at the last case conference. And I don't think really there's much more to be said about that. Where are the decision makers? Where's the decision making? And when we do our new risk assessment, when it's done, are we going back to constantly look at that, to look at the new information that has emerged, to look at the supports that has been put in the meantime, and to look and see where are the outcomes for the children now? If they're the same as the day we walked into that house, something is going wrong somewhere. Our risk assessment is perhaps not as clear as it should be, or our plan of work, our care plan. And none of what I'm saying is to belie the fact that most children in the care system do very well. We know that because we see that, unlike in the past when you could see a clear difference between educational attainment, for example, and a whole lot of well-being measures, children in the care system, particularly those who are placed in family-type settings, are doing well. But we have to also, so they've been risked, their situation has been appropriately assessed, their needs have been met, and they're doing okay, which is what we want for all children in the care system. Because I think we have to be careful to watch out for our setting our standards too low. And again, this was already outlined for you this morning. The other one piece, and that I think informs me and gives me great hope for the future, is the lack of referral to early services. For many cases we looked at, there was no referrals to early intervention and prevention services. I don't know whether it was that they weren't there or nobody thought about them, but I think in the new agency, I want to support the development and the close knitting together of services for all children, from earliest times problems occur right up until the point when we want them rehabilitated back home, whether that's pre-care or whether that's after-care for a long period or a short period. I have been asked to take up the chair of the new agency. I'm not fully approved yet because I've been told I have to appear before a committee of the Houses of the Oireachtas. So I can't say I'm there yet. So everybody who talks to me, I say, no, I'm not really in post at all yet. And I'm not. Good things have happened in Ireland in the last couple of years. We have a minister, we have a whole department devoted to our children, our young people, and we have a senior management team in place that I have some experience of, and one of whom you're going to hear from shortly, Annie Callaghan, that are putting together the kind of frameworks that will help the new agency. Most importantly for me, and I was again part of the task force that was asked by the Minister to consider how it might all work, was the coming together of the different professionals that are required to deliver a quality child welfare and protection service for all of our children. Some of them are going to come together quite quickly in the new agencies, others are going to be part of phase 2. What I know is, if we don't get the necessary across the board professionals and services into this new agencies, or working well with the new agency in a very linked way, then it is not going to do. It is not going to serve the needs of our children and young people. My biggest hope is that the new agency, that it will be built from the needs and rights of the children and families who require the services. And in operation, the management of this agency at all levels needs to ensure that any barriers to accessing services are torn down quickly, wherever they originate from. I fear that history teaches us that change is more often resisted than embraced. The commitment to get that change in place and working is present, and it's held at all levels of responsibility. I think we heard that very clearly. There will be steps back along the way, but we must recommit, re-evaluate and move on. Maintaining the status quo is not an option. As a society, we need to establish a culture of listening to our children, listening to our families, paying attention to them, but making sure that when we're looking at outcomes, it is the outcomes for them, and we must make sure that the outcomes are positive. I think we know what the future should be like for child welfare and child protection. All government departments, agencies working together. No ignoring problems until they reach crisis proportions. That has been too evidenced in reviews. It's also clear that where children are not safe, that we move to place them where they will be safe. We need to plan for the future, and I am reminded of the words of the author Alice Walker. Always keep in mind the present you are constructing. It should be the future that you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora. And I think Nora has set a high bar for our next speakers in terms of timekeeping. Also, just to say thank you very much to Nora, and I think it's fair to say, as you heard from her there, she has a unique combination of perspectives to bring to bear on our conversations today. And I think she's touched a number of issues that others have raised, not least that idea of not only listening and hearing children's voices, but kind of understanding their experience and how relevant that is to the work that we're all trying to do. And I was also interested in her idea about when we're trying to fix things, about the systems that we all work in, that at the end of the day it comes down to human behaviour, and really fixing will only, if it doesn't tackle the human behaviours that are actually around the delivery of services, we won't get too far. So our next speaker this afternoon is Tony Rogers, and Tony is the Assistant Director of Social Care and Children in the Health and Social Care Board. He has responsibility across the continuum of children's services and has chaired the Legacy Southern Area Child Protection Committee for 3 years. For 3 years was the chair of the Regional Child Protection Committee for the transition to the Southern Board for Northern Ireland. He has worked with the DHSSPS and trusts on the reform agenda as it applies to children's services. So he's going to tell us a little bit about reform and how we're going to do it. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Just to say it's a relief that the laptop works when I come over here. The last time I had the timekeeper went dramatically wrong. Just so as you know that before I start. It was part of a management course, and towards the end, externally assessed, and towards the end, we'd been advised that we'd get the finger up at the back when we had a minute left. I thought it was someone asking a question and that I was engaging the audience. I won't tell you how the marks went. The other bits, just in terms of, and I think it's probably been said by some of the other speakers and referenced by Karen also, much of the work that we have taken forward has been very much a collaboration. And can I start by saying that if you have any concerns or doubts about any of the products that we've produced, can you remember that it's been a collaboration? If there's any of the products or things that I'm going to mention that you think have been very, very positive, that has been visionary leadership. Now, in terms of time, I better move. I'm going to cover those 4 areas. And I've been asked to focus on systems and organisations. You've probably heard some of this, so I'm not proposing to go into significant detail in terms of inquiries and case management reviews, both within the Legacy Southern Area Child Protection Committee and the Regional Child Protection Committee. Then I obviously had some responsibility for the commissioning of case management reviews, and I think that we've endeavoured as we've moved forward, and Hugh may say something more on this, in trying to clearly move the focus and emphasis to it being a learning process and trying to be a facilitated process. But the overall catalyst for the reform process for ourselves within Northern Ireland was the Child Protection Overview Inspection Report undertaken by the Department at that stage and produced towards the end of 2006, resulted in the development of the RIT, which is the Reform Implementation Team, in 2007. And I was just thinking in terms of what Helen said about numbers of recommendations. I think between the Child Protection Overview Inspection Report and the Trust Individual Reports, we trumped the 500 plus by quite a bit. And I think it really is something to be mindful of, and I think as we move forward as well with case management reviews, that we've been very conscious of having smart recommendations, a small number of key recommendations that are going to make a difference. I think there is an understandable anxiety when we have review processes, but as I think has been articulated this morning, it is critical and vital that we have a vehicle to help us understand whether and when things are working, but also when improvements need to be made. So I think within that context, there's an increasing understanding of the benefits of these processes being taken forward in a learning environment. And it doesn't detract, which I think has been one of the big issues, with the need to directly deal with poor practice or malpractice. Where that is evident, then it's the responsibility of employers and regulatory bodies to look at that. Again, you've heard from some of the other speakers about consistent findings articulated within these various reports, and that included the lack of communication between and across agencies and within disciplines, issues of recording and poor assessment, adherence to policy and procedure, and sometimes the need for independent oversight and the difficulty, particularly in very enmeshed cases, for practitioners and chairs of conferences and so forth being able to see the wood for the trees. And also there was a view about us not always hearing the voice of the child and understanding what it was like from the child's perspective. And I think laterally, and particularly with some of the inquiries that have taken place in England, there are issues for us about engaging with parental hostility and parental acquiescence. The RIT structures in the first instance were very much on a multi-agency perspective and looked, I suppose, that the focus in the first instance was about clearly promoting the view, and obviously continues to be important, that child protection is everyone's business across all of the various agencies, and at that juncture, thanks to the promotion and the messages that were coming from our department across the range of departments also. As we've moved along, both within RIT and as we've moved to the CSIB, which is Children's Services Improvement Board, then we've utilised a range of work streams to take forward various initiatives. We have work streams for, and some of these have progressed and been extant as we've gone along. Some of them have been stood down and set back up again as the time progressed, and then we've either set aside some work streams and set up new ones as the need dictates. We've looked at areas such as information systems. Michael Murray's been the chair of that, and Michael's with us today. Roles and grades, which was fundamental in helping us to take forward consistent job descriptions and role clarification right across the piece, but particularly introducing the role of principal practitioner, clarity around differentiation between principal practitioner and senior practitioner, and so forth down through the system. Training, which Karen is currently chairing, and I was conscious of one of the slides earlier that indicated about not dumping everything on training, and maybe we've a bit of a tendency to do that, but we're clearly trying to marry the work that's ongoing within other work streams and where there's a training dimension. We've looked at caseload management, and some of you may be interested in that. If you are, you can ask our guru, who is Deirdre Mahan. I'm very happy to be approached and to provide expert guidance and advice. Residential childcare has been and continues to be looked at, and Jackie McGarvey is the chair of that. And legal issues, which Tom Cassidy's chair. I did say it was a collaboration, so it's just to reflect that we've had these people involved. We've terms of reference for each of the work streams, and they're adopted as work progresses. And the transference, I suppose, from RIT into the Children's Services Improvement Board, which has been reflected in some of the case management reviews and within the overview report, was to make sure that we were making the necessary connections, particularly with the delegated statutory function on child protection services and the interface with other elements of the DSF. I probably don't need to say much about this, self-explanatory. Can I also say it's work in progress? And can I also say I was pestered to get this by Leslie Walker and Marion Hall, which is why it's where it's at the moment. I'm not sure if you can read it from there. You'll not read it from here either, but just to let you know that's another version. But what it emphasises is the need to, and stresses the importance of looking at the system as a whole. And I've referenced the origins of RIT and the cross-departmental multi-agency work, the interface with DSF, and across your far right, you'll see the reference to the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership. And I think that it's imperative, and you've heard about the early intervention agenda, and we are working very hard at trying to make sure that all parts of our system speak to one another, and that there is a focus on the early intervention agenda, and particularly from a multi-agency perspective. You've heard reference earlier as well to the development of, and the Minister talked about the investment in family support hubs, and particularly the collaborative working with our colleagues in the voluntary and community sector, and likewise within childcare partnerships, which are specifically involved in the early years, and some elements of the family support framework. And the other bits where we're looking to make, and it's important that we make some of the develop and maintain our relationships clearly with the Safeguarding Board, and there have been a number of workshops and connections to do that with the Bamford group within our own jurisdiction, and looking particularly at transition in terms of young people with mental health difficulties and moving into adulthood, the public protection arrangements, and I think, as was referenced previously, arrangements that are in place for domestic violence. We also have a number there of regional work streams, and they feed back in through the Children's Services Improvement Board around fostering adoption, leaving and aftercare, and the hidden harm agenda. And more recently, we've some work progressing collaboratively with colleagues in the south of Ireland on the sharing of data, on issues about the collation and relevance of information, and particularly processes relating to children within the leaving and aftercare system, and trafficked and unaccompanied children. And I suppose it's necessary within all of that framework to have a commitment to make things work. We have a Children's Services project manager in the form of Marion Hall, and we have, as you can see on the chart, change coordinators within each of the trusts, and they help us to make things happen and to bring a sense of coordination. In terms of products, and there have been a whole raft of these, so if there are other things, then I'm more than happy, and hopefully there'll be some contact details shared that people can request those of us. We've a whole range of the products currently on the departmental website as well, if anyone wishes to access. But we focused in on what we have called the Unicini. If that's not familiar to anyone in Northern Ireland, then you're in big trouble. And for colleagues in Southern Ireland, then it's an acronym for Understanding the Needs of Children in Northern Ireland. And that's our referral and assessment process. And we've looked to maintain a consistency through the pathways in terms of the format that's applied between referral and initial assessment, and then flowing through from family support, child protection, looked after children, and leaving and aftercare. And that's hopefully to reduce some of the duplication and the work that people are putting through. We've endeavoured within the pathways also to have a child focus, and the child's views are clearly asked for on the relevant documentation, as are the views of parents. I think there has been a view, and some of my colleagues may not be happy with this, but there has been a view offered that we may need to look at the structure of our documentation to more clearly reflect the emphasis on the child. We've also, across the statutory agencies, sought to acquire what's known as a CJSM licence, which is really facilitates us for the secure exchange of information. And we're looking again to broaden that out. That both helps in terms of other agencies making available information to us via the Unigenie or into trust via the Unigenie, and sharing information back and forth across, particularly, as I've said, at this juncture, the statutory agencies, and SBNI have also adopted that for the transference of information in relation to the case management reviews. The primary focus of all of this work, I was consciously listening this morning about a view about too much paper, and we have been very, very conscious of bureaucracy and seeking to reduce that. And whilst there's a lot of policy and guidance there, that's actually replacing what had been previous. It's not an addition to, but our drive has been for the promotion of regional consistency and trying to make sure that as much as possible, and I think this pertains to all of us, to trying to address the issue of the postcode lottery, and that we don't have families resident in particular localities who, presenting with perhaps similar type of circumstances, who are receiving different responses. So we're seeking to address that as best we can. We've looked at and you've heard mention this morning of the gateway service, and that is the single point of entry within trust for childcare referrals. And there is now just one single point of entry within each of the trusts, one phone number that other professionals and, importantly, members of the public and community access services through. There are fewer managers involved then, fewer managers involved in screening, and fewer managers involved in making important decisions. And again, what we're trying to do is to look at the whole issue of thresholding and trying to have greater consistency. We've looked within, we have a threshold group, we've produced documentation both in terms of threshold of need and threshold of intervention, and we put in some of the peer support, peer review mechanisms conjointly with Queen's University to bring those key managers together at different points in time and try to facilitate them in undertaking what is a complex and difficult task. We've produced guidance that you've seen there on dual processes, and that really is about children who are both within the looked after system and the child protection systems. And we had a number of children, or probably an excessive number of children. And what we've determined, and the guidance been issued by the department, is that the looked after system and children's care plans should be adequately and appropriately, I've now got 5 minutes, adequately and appropriately addressing any child protection concerns. And finally, just in terms of reflecting on some of the product, Tom Cassidy's workstream, the legal issues, has just produced guidance for us, and which we're still working through, but looking at the use of expert witnesses, and particularly acknowledging and promoting the role of social work as an expert witness, and also seeking to, conjointly with our colleagues within the department, to have an engagement with the judiciary and looking at reducing delay within court processes. So some of the challenges and the way forward. I think just to say that we have also review mechanisms in place to update and replace products. I think that there will continue to remain for all of us an issue about thresholds. And for me there are a number, and for all of us there are a number of thresholds. There's thresholds about offering support in the first instance. There's a threshold in terms of constituting referral and to have clarity when children are at risk of significant harm. There's an issue about robust assessments and informing when children require to become looked after and the threshold thereafter. And then there's a threshold for securing permanency for children in a timely manner. And when I say securing permanency, that may well be about rehabilitation back home, but it may be also permanency with alternative carers. I've mentioned there the promotion of transforming your care, which is a significant review of health and social care within Northern Ireland, very clearly articulating the message about the importance of early intervention and the review of the LAC system, which we're seeking to take forward at this point in time. The interface with other processes have reflected in terms of the strategic partnership, early intervention agenda, and the SB&I, and just being conscious that in so doing that we're not producing additional bureaucracy, that we're trying to strive for clarity of role, and that where possible that we're maximising opportunity. I think there will be a big challenge for Northern Ireland and within Southern Ireland in terms of driving forward the efficiency, and I mean that in terms of both productivity and financial efficiency, whilst maintaining and improving safety and quality. It is a difficult financial climate, and within that, issues of professional judgment become ever more important, and we need to ensure that those families and children who need help are identified and are either signposted to the right help, or if statutory intervention is required, that they're there to provide it. And likewise, in terms of the realisation of the Monroe review, then I think elimination of the bureaucracy, looking at issues around the development of the guidance, the benefits of targets and policy and recording will be and continue to be important, but keep it proportionate. We want strong and robust, succinct assessments with decisive and informed professional judgment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony, and I'm certainly outperforming on the timekeeping front, Sean. I want to point that out to you. Thank you very much. I think some of the people from the Republic will certainly have had a lot of resonance with the kinds of issues that Tony covered there. I'm really, looking at the system as a whole and seeing those various connections, and indeed the change agenda is very, very much overlapping in terms of the kinds of issues that are occupying our minds, particularly around things like assessment processes and thresholds, and looking at single points of entry into the system and combining protection, welfare and family supports. It's all very interesting to see the degree of overlap. So thank you for that, Tony. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, who's Annie Callan. And Annie is a UK registered social worker with a background in child protection and mental health services. She has worked in and managed children's and adult services for over 30 years. Her experience ranges from establishing new organisations in local government areas to establishing the joint commissioning and shared service agreements across the public health and with the NHS. She's currently the Head of Quality Assurance for the new Child and Family Agency. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you very much. The first thing I want to say is it's an honour and a privilege to be in Ireland, talking to an Irish audience at an all-Ireland conference, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to, I can look at this and it comes up here, sorry, just reminding myself of the technology as I get started. I am Head of Quality at the Child and Family Agency, and I just want to say that I'm Head of Quality at the emerging child and family agency, as we're not a child and family agency yet, but we soon will be. I spent my career, I was born and brought up here in Ireland, and I spent my career in the UK, so it's quite interesting at this stage of my career to come back. I'm going to be talking about learning lessons, and I'm going to talk about learning lessons from serious case reviews, and I'm going to concentrate on that from a UK perspective for several reasons. One of them is when I realised the lineup today, I knew everybody else would be talking about Ireland and indeed New Zealand, and that was inspiring and wonderful. And certainly from New Zealand, family group conferences were something that were welcomed in the UK and very useful. But the other reason is that there has been a very significant volume of work done on this in the UK. And I also wanted to bring the message, which is what I said in my interview. We haven't got it sorted out either when I was there. They haven't got it sorted out either, is what I would say to you today. This is complex, it's not straightforward, it's not simple, and everybody is still grappling with it. But there are things that we can learn. I'm looking at, the research I looked at is Sinclair and Bullock in 2002, Laming 2003. The overview from Key Messages from Davis and Ward in 2011, which distilled 15 inquiries, and Monroe in 2013. I'll then move on to cover the opportunities and the challenges. Sinclair and Bullock in 2002 looked at 40 cases, and they found that only one of the 40 cases they scrutinised was seen as highly predictable, 1 out of 40, and only 3 was highly preventable. The factors common to the cases, they felt, had limited predictive value, and I think this is really important in terms of where the UK went with all of this by the time we got to Laming. They had limited predictive value for identifying which children will become victims of abuse within the general population. And another serious case review I read has said that they found, and they were asked at the beginning of that serious case review, the chair was asked if in learning lessons they could give some indication of which children were at risk of serious injury or death. And the chair in that case said that they found that they couldn't possibly say, that there was absolutely nothing to distinguish that family and that set of circumstances from all of the other families and all of the other sets of circumstances that were so similar and so familiar to that particular area. So trying to get to the sort of the detail of this is actually very, very difficult. But once serious case reviews started in the UK, and once the idea caught hold, that's where we went with it then. I'm here to try and make sure we don't do that here to the same extent. Sinclair and Bullock found that lessons to be learned from serious case reviews were more about processes and systems for handling risk of harm than about identifying vulnerable children. And you've heard all of these earlier today, the most commonly identified practice shortcomings were inadequate sharing of information in 25 cases. In 23 cases, there had been poor assessment processes, ineffective decision-making in 21 cases, and a lack of interagency working in 17. Poor recording of information was present in 15, and a lack of information on significant males was present in 9. The profile of children and the circumstances were that infants under 1 year of age made up 47% of their cases, and I think that's quite different here. We have older children in these serious case reviews. Young people 16 plus made up 11%. There were 66% of the cases were child deaths and 34% were serious injury, and that probably reflects the fact that that was the criteria for a serious case review. It had to be either a child death or a serious injury. the profile of parents and carers. And I do think these things are helpful. I'll come back to this because it does give us a sort of profile of circumstances. Domestic violence was present in 50%. In one serious case I did at one point, a serious case review I did at one point in my career in the UK, it was a case, it was a murder of a 3-year-old child. And the research I looked at that point in time said that there was a 75% correlation between children on the Child Protection Register and households living in households where there was domestic violence. And that's huge. That's absolutely huge. And yet the services have remained and do remain quite separate. Teenage mothers made up 28% of the sample, and domestic violence in combination of drug misuse, mental ill health, father's hostility, and disguised compliance. And disguised compliance is something that we all deal with. The environmental characteristics and circumstances were frequent house moves, poverty and poor living conditions, large families, which are unusual in the UK, and children previously removed and previous deaths. And we certainly, I've found lots of cases and had experience of lots of cases where we were removing one child and then the next child, and then the next child, and then the next child, and then the next child from mothers who continuously had babies. And at times they ended up keeping 1 or 2. And accidents. Okay. In Davis and Ward in 2011, they undertook a study that distilled the messages from 15 other studies conducted following the tragic death of Victoria Climbié in 2002 and Peter Connolly in 2007. And for those of you who don't know, Victoria Climbié and Peter Connolly were Haringey children. And Victoria Climbié's death changed the focus of social work in the UK very, very significantly indeed, and sadly not for the better, in my opinion. Their research was carried out because the inquiry following the death of Victoria Climbié made it clear that a number of long-standing problems repeatedly raised by numerous child abuse inquiries over the preceding 30 years had still not been overcome. So we were dealing with these issues time and time and time again, and we do need to move to something different. Some of their key findings were that long-term corrosive impact of abuse and neglect on children's long-term life chances is not sufficiently recognised. Interventions can be indecisive or delayed. The neglect of adolescents is difficult to recognise and too often goes unnoticed. A number of high-quality, validated, specific interventions are available to address need. However, most specific interventions are short in duration, and continuing support that is required and needed is not often available. There is a lack of evidence-based services to address intimate partner violence. Proactive social work can be very effective when it happens, and the outcomes for children tend to be better where there is careful assessment, thoughtful planning, and proactive case management. I came out of a 3.5-year period of my career where I spent it in the Social Services Inspectorate, and during that time I had been involved in either leading on performance management, leading inspections into all services, leading on performance management, or involved in meetings and you know, a bit part in other people's inspections or whatever, or part of an inspection team in about 45 different local authorities. And I think one of the things that I brought with me out of that is that it is always about the front end. That if you get the front end of the services right, if you manage them properly, and if people are aware right through the organisation of what's happening at the front end and supporting it, then it's more likely to be better. And the local authorities where it wasn't, it was the management, as well as some of the front end services. Okay, where was I? They also found, and this is, I have been told is controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, but you know, it isn't for me, but they did also find, and there's a couple of studies that reinforce this now in the United Kingdom, that the majority of abused children looked after by local authorities or by the state tend to do better than those who remain at home. Care works for these children. There are stronger links between professionals and adult mental health, substance misuse, intimate partner violence, and in children's services would prevent children being abused and the consequences of abuse going unnoticed. Okay. Before that, in 2003, we had Victoria Climbier's death and the Laming inquiry. I was part of the inspection team that went into Haringey following Victoria Climbier's death. And we went in as a team to look at what was happening in Haringey and carry out an inspection. And we went in during a pause in the inquiry because it broke halfway through. Because we were meant to go in at the end, but the inquiry just ran and ran, and it grew, and more people were pulled into it, including people who'd previously inspected it, who were brought in front of the inquiry and had to justify previous findings. Everybody who went to that inquiry, probably including the family, I don't know, but every professional who went to that inquiry brought a lawyer with them. I'm not a big fan of public inquiries. I don't know that they achieve an awful lot. But Laming said in 2003 that supervision is the cornerstone of good social work practice, and he was right, and should be seen to operate effectively at all levels in an organisation. The provision of supervision may have looked good on paper. Haringey had very good policies and procedures. They did. I read them. They were very good. But in practice, it was woefully inadequate, and that was true for many of the frontline staff. This must change. The same is true for the police and for health services. Unfortunately, the police and health services didn't get it quite as badly as social services did in the press. He said, very controversially in my view, that Victoria died because those responsible for her care adopted poor practice standards. Following that, the Association of Directors of Children's Services were asked to fill out a self-evaluation form, and were asked at that time to be as honest as they possibly could be about the state of children's services in the UK. They responded. I was at the SSI during this time. They responded. They filled it out and they said exactly like it was. And what followed that was that information, in their words at that time, I have to say, was used against them, and I think that was accurate. We then moved to counting. We moved to performance indicators being the single most important thing. Now, I wouldn't say that that was the case for everybody that was in the Department of Health, and I wouldn't say that that was what anybody particularly thought was the most important thing in the sector. But somehow, and someday I might be able to get up in front of you and tell you exactly what my analysis of that was, somehow they became hugely important. It was as if it was all so awful that the adults in the room, which was all of us, wanted to do something, and the doing something felt that we could count stuff, and then we'd feel better. Terribly sadly, and I have to tell you, I can practically tell you where I was standing when I heard the news that another Haringey child had died in yet another high-profile case, although none of us ever know why some cases make it to the media and others don't. Peter Connolly died in 2007. No, he didn't. I've got that date wrong. Wipe that out. I'm thinking about something else. But after Peter Connolly died, we had the Monroe Review. And it was with relief, I think, that directors of children's services, well, I know that, directors of children's services and those of us working in the sector at that time read this from Monroe. She said that one fundamental change that was needed is for all to have realistic expectations of how well professionals can protect children and young people. The work involves uncertainty. We cannot know for sure what is going on in the privacy of family life. nor can we predict with certainty what will happen. Too often, expectations have become unrealistic, demanding that professionals ensure children's safety, strengthening a belief that if something bad happens, some professional somewhere must be to blame. She also said, this has contributed to the development of a defensive culture, it did, that focuses on compliance with targets and rules instead of whether services are providing effective help. Having realistic expectations of professionals will make it easier for them to have confidence to use judgment instead of applying rules that do not match a specific child's needs, and the humility to reflect on the weaknesses in their practice so that they can learn. So we need a more open culture. Is your head of quality, for those of you who are from the South, standing here saying we're throwing out the numbers? No, I'm not. I still think they're important. Okay. Applying lessons, then, from serious case reviews is, in my view, extremely complex. However, it is possible to identify common factors in the profile of children, parents, their circumstances to inform planning, management and practice. We have to have some picture in our head of what this looks like and what the service needs are. We need to accept that managing child protection is about managing risk. Okay. Policy and procedures and systems and structures do not, in and of themselves, protect children, but they are essential to accountability, and we are accountable, and they do help. We need to understand the volume, we need to understand the pressure, we need to understand the need for services that surround us, and apply evidence to the provision that we provide to meet that need. We need to support staff and managers and check at every level that the things we think are being done in practice are in fact being done. And crucially, we need to take decisive action where there is no evidence of concrete improvement. So our challenges. We need to establish a clear and consistent data set. I'm coming back to the numbers. It's useful to, and this is the crucial obsession of mine, that it's useful to and it is used by managers, and that we understand it is just indicators, but yes, they are important. We have three types. We have Swiss, we have RAISE, and the other third type is a variation on a theme of paper. We need one, and we need to understand it, so we understand the volume and the pressure. We need to implement a quality assurance system that's helpful and supports improved practice, establish close working relationship with colleagues in health, education, the Gardaí and the voluntary sector. And we need to achieve sustainable improvement. So I'm not aiming for short-term improvement. This is going to take time. The opportunities, we will work hard to support our staff and managers. That's really, really important, so that they and we understand risk and meet the needs of vulnerable children through evidence-based casework. Review our performance indicators so we're confident we collect the information we need and it's useful to us. And implement a practical quality assurance service that identifies clear action at every level in the organisation that we all agree to and understand, so that we evaluate our own work. We're not waiting for other people to come in and do that for us. We're doing it. And I'm a huge fan of focus groups with staff, with children, and in using peer review, improving services that are consistent and that meet our commitment to children in their family and their families, and to be accountable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annie, and I think that's been really interesting at this stage of our day, I think, to really highlight the very delicate balance that has to be found between the demand and the right demand for accountability and for standards, with this idea that there has to be realistic expectations about what the services can do for children and families, and also to understand a little bit better the limitations on the predictability of some of the crises that happen for individual children and their families. And that's something I think that needs to be understood beyond the cadre of social work professionals, because it's really important, I think, to other people who are working with children and families and in the systems that we're all working in. So thank you very much for that, Annie. So now, without further ado, we'll have Hugh Connor. Hugh Connor is a social worker who has worked across the social services over many years, and including as a Director of Social Services for the last 15 years. He took up the post as the first chairman of a new public body, the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, in July 2011. He is currently a Director of Extra Care and a Trustee of the Simon Community in Northern Ireland, and was previously the Northern Ireland Trustee on British Association for Adoption and Fostering. Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'll try not to keep you too long. But I do want to talk a little bit about the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, and particularly I want to talk to our colleagues in the South, because I want to highlight what is the board, why we have such a board, what its role is, who's on the board, and what are the issues we're seeking to address. And that will be the major part of my presentation. But before I do that, I actually want to commend to you this particular book, which isn't about North-South, but it's about the 4 home countries in the United Kingdom. And for the very first time, the NSPCC launched this document 2 weeks ago, basically trying to look at trends across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And there's some very, very interesting things in this. One of the things the NSPCC have done very well is they've actually highlighted from the outset where the data isn't comparable and where there are difficulties, and where it would be wrong to make too firm or too concrete conclusions. But nonetheless, let's start with good news, and we'll move through to some other forms of messages. But the good news messages, well, the very first thing to be said is, as John said earlier on, in terms of actually deaths across the United Kingdom, the number of children who die year on year as a result of child abuse is dropping. The number of children who are physically abused or are sexually abused is dropping. So there's some clear messages that need to get out. I want to start actually by showing you a couple of slides from this. And I'm not sure how I feel about this, to be perfectly honest. What this first slide shows you is that for the year 2012 in Northern Ireland, there were 35,000 referrals made to social services. 35,000. That involved 28,000 children. 28,000 children works out as 1 child in every 16. So we're seeing 6% of our children are being referred for services, not necessarily child protection or neglect, but that is the highest number of children in the United Kingdom. The next slide actually goes on to show you the number of children who, having been referred, then go to assessment. And you will see that for the first time last year, the figure for England exceeded the figure for Northern Ireland, because traditionally Northern Ireland from 2007 was actually assessing children much more than any other part of the United Kingdom. And finally, this is the number of children on our child protection register per 10,000. And again, you will see that Northern Ireland actually has more children on the child protection register than any other part of the United Kingdom. Now, you could say, is this good or is it not good? I think at a time of financial stringency, when basically there are some very difficult decisions to be made around thresholding, actually seeing children and carrying out an assessment of their and their families' needs, all things else being considered, is generally a good message. But I do think that one of the things this shows is that the system in Northern Ireland is working in overdrive. And I think that's a very important message for everyone, politicians as well. I think the other thing that I want to sort of turn it to is some of the not so good messages. And if I may, I just want to read you 2 paragraphs from this report. And this is about suicides. And I should put a health warning on this, because in terms of the suicides, the numbers are so small that the reliability of the data is questionable. So please bear that in mind. I don't think this is just a start, but nonetheless the message is in here. And it basically says the suicide rate of 15 to 19-year-olds is more than 4 times higher in Northern Ireland and England and Wales, and 44% higher than Scotland, which is more akin to ourselves. Perhaps more worryingly, but again the numbers are very small, the suicide rate of 10 to 14-year-olds is 10 times higher in England and Wales, and 56%, double the rate in Scotland. Now again, small numbers, but there's clearly a message in here that as we achieve improvements in terms, if you like, of Maslow's safety needs, what we're actually seeing coming to the fore is a different range of issues for children. And this is reflected in sort of some of the childline messages, where you see more and more people, more and more children asking for help with self-harm, asking for help around bullying, having suicidal ideation. And one of the things probably is that the nature of child protection is changing, and probably beginning to change further as we actually sort of move over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's possibly one of the questions that we need to address here or elsewhere. How do we respond to those changes? Let me, if I may, actually move to the Safeguarding Board, just for 10 minutes or so. And I think the very first thing, that particular slide is meant to convey the differences between the Safeguarding Board and what was before, which Tony chaired, which was the Regional Child Protection Committee. And you can see, if you look down this particular list, that there are some quite starkly different features that was required. The very first thing was that the Safeguarding Board in Northern Ireland is set up in primary legislation. I mean, it is independent of every organisation. I, as the chairman, am directly responsible to the minister. I'm a ministerial appointee through the Department of Health. And basically a whole emphasis here is actually in trying to make sure that we have policy leaders on the board. Now, when Annie was talking, she was talking about Victoria Columbier, and she was talking about the front line. And what Herbert Laming also said in the Victoria Columbier report was that the greatest problem he could see wasn't the hapless practice that existed at that particular point in time, and for which the frontline social workers were being bullied and harassed by the local media, but it was the fact that senior officers in the organisation did not know what was actually happening at the front line. And I mean, that echoes some of the things you were saying, Patricia, about your referral cases today. And very clearly what Laming suggested was that the big change he wanted to see was a greater emphasis upon getting together a multidisciplinary group, that basically child protection, safeguarding is everyone's business, and it needs to be manifestly so. And what he was also suggesting was that he believed that the people who came onto the board needed to be at a high level. So you will see that in terms of the Safeguarding Board, the level of membership is either Chief Executive or Director, Chief Constable or Assistant Chief Constable. And that's reflected right through the 27-person board that has been created. That's the objectives that were set by the department to coordinate and ensure the effectiveness of what is done by each person or body represented on the board, and I'll show you who's on the board in a moment, for the purposes of safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children. And that's a very, very big brief. During the time when we were trying to establish it, we had many discussions with Eilish, who was really a very strong supporter of the board, about that verb, ensure, about what it meant and how to go about doing it. And I think we came to a number of different perspectives. I mean, and I think it brings us back to what John said earlier on, that there's not just one way of looking at this, and that essentially the ensuring task means to take a look at what's happening across a whole range of things, and the same sorts of issues that John was referring to today: research, audit, inspection reports, CMRs, things that are going well. And that's the basis upon which we need to be looking at how we ensure and coordinate. The other issue that we do have is we have a power. We have the power to ask for and get information from our member agencies. And we also have the power to ask our member agencies to conduct a review, an audit, under Article 12. Now, there are a set of duties which is given to every public body, and so there's no additional powers given here. But what we are able to do is actually say to every organisation, what we have the power to do is actually ask the agencies to reflect on their own practice and to identify those issues which would be a cause of some concern for them. That's the board. I mean, it's a very large board. It's a very daunting board when you're sitting at the chair of it, because basically it's also not just large, but there are people of real kudos on the board in the Northern Ireland context. People who are very, very experienced. And clearly it has been set up in such a way as to try and capture a full range of inputs from organisations and professions, be they actually in the voluntary community or actually statutory sector. Here are our functions, and I want to tell you just a little bit about where we are with some of these things and sort of broaden out, not just to the functions, but to the structures that we have put in place. We're a tiny organisation. I mean, truthfully, I'm a part-time chair, and we have 3 professional officers and about 4 admin staff. So when you see this list of things, you will say to yourself, how the hell would anybody do this? And you'd be quite right to say, how the hell would anybody do this? But the reality is that we're not set up as a doing organisation. That's not our role and function. Our role and function is as an oversight body, and I'll explain as we go through what I mean by that. Our role and function is as a facilitator in places and as a challenger in other places. So essentially, you can see a number of issues here that we're required to do. We're currently, like everyone else, and Paul McConville's doing it, actually revising our guidance with a view, like Monroe, to reduce the actual length of documentation. Paul will do that. When Paul does that, there will become a need for us to review how we, as a group of agencies, member agencies, actually implement these policies. So there's a big issue. What are the issues that are causing concern across the multidisciplinary framework, and how can those policies and procedures be amended to actually get a greater buy-in or a greater consistency? An issue that's been going for a long time, which is just to promote the awareness of the need to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. And we have, as well as a Policy and Procedures Committee, we also have an Engagement and Communication Committee. And that Engagement and Communication Committee is charged with that second responsibility. And they actually are also charged with conducting one of the big issues for us, which is basically promoting communication between the board and children. This is enshrined in law. The department very clearly said, we believe there's been insufficient attention paid to hearing the voice of children. We are now charging you, Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, with showing at a strategic and operational and policy level you do that. And that's one of the things which I feel very strongly about as the chair, that we have to demonstrate that we have done this and are doing it and are seeking to improve our performance in it. 2 other things. We talked earlier on about case management reviews. I just want to say a couple of things about case management reviews, if I may. The first thing is that we're just in the process of actually adopting this. I don't know why I said at the very beginning, we were actually launched on the 12th of September last year. So we've been going 7 months. But we've actually got our case management review panel up, and it's chaired by John Devaney. And we're in the process of actually looking at basically how we take forward the cases, those cases that are referred to us. We've just actually gone out and recruited a group of 7 individuals who will conduct these case management reviews on our behalf. We believe they're probably going to be about 8 a year. We also are in the process of putting some training together. Now, one of the things we're required to carry out case management review in criteria set for us in the legislation. What we also believe is that we need some other tools in our toolkit as to how we can carry out different types of review. And certainly this is one of the things we'd be very keen to talk to Helen about, and also to a lady called Wendy Rose, who's done some really interesting work in Wales, looking at how case management review processes can be managed differently. At the heart of the case management review process is definitely our belief that we've got to understand the child's daily life. That's one of the things that we need to try and ensure that we develop a strong system of. And as Tony said, for once, we're actually going to also look and seek positive cases. When Sean was setting this up, what he was essentially seeking to do was to make sure that there was a balance, that it wasn't only a bad news story, but basically there was some positive news out of this. And the other thing Sean actually asked me to think about as chair was, during my chairmanship, would I produce for him some sort of report setting out what is the way to optimise learning. And the way to optimise learning, obviously, as John Devaney was suggesting earlier on, is to put some of that work into a wider context. So we actually have also a case management review panel. Another thing that we haven't yet got is we have the responsibility for looking at the deaths of all children in Northern Ireland who died unexpectedly. Now, this is as simple as I've said it. If you woke up this morning and you didn't believe your child would be dead tonight, then we're charged from a public health perspective of actually gathering information on that death and looking to see what lessons we can learn on it. We know there are about 200 such deaths a year in Northern Ireland. We know that 80 of these deaths generally occur in the first 4 to 6 weeks of life, and many of them are associated with the debate that the Minister was in the Dáil this morning about the issue of people carrying fetuses that cannot grow outside the womb full term, and some of those neonatal deaths. We also know that there's another 20% of the children who die by a year. And then you have the bigger spike of probably something like 40 or 50 deaths when children reach adolescence and where risk-taking behaviours become much more prevalent. And again, our particular task here is to gather all the information, to start to create some sort of benchmark report for this, but basically to look, is there a way of doing things that are preventable? And one of the things that we all know in this room straight away, and is being shown again in our first few deaths, is the question of lying over, of basically parents, perhaps with drink or drugs taken, bringing children into bed and lying over. And we see that repeated. We knew it 10 years ago, and it's being repeated now. And it's certainly one of the issues we want to look at again. Although a lot of work has been done, is there anything more we can do to prevent this very preventable death? Finally, if I may, sorry, I should say one other thing. We've got two other committees, two very important committees. One is the Education and Training Committee, and the Education and Training Committee is charged with looking across the member agencies and trying to develop a standard training process that would be used for all frontline staff. What the staff need to know, given their profession, because it's different. Some staff will need to know a lot more than others. But by and large, what is that, for want of a better word, prescription that we need to have and put in place? And the other thing is that we just don't have a safeguarding board. We have safeguarding panels in each of the trust areas. And that was, again, a very deliberate attempt by the department to consider not only a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach. So there's one of the chairs of the panels, man who chairs, John Toner, who chairs 3 panels, is actually here today. We've got someone else chairing 2 other panels. And essentially their role and function is to actually hear first hand from the local panel, what are the issues, what are the emerging issues, but also to try and ensure that the board's strategic plan is delivered. And that brings me to the final slide, if I may. And that's our draft 3-year strategic plan. We've managed in 6 or 7 months to actually get the panels up, get the board established. The board's met 3 times. With the panels working, we've now produced the draft strategic plan, which is out for consultation for 2 or 3 months. Some of the issues that we've sought to try and tackle in this, and I'll just give you a feel and a flavour for this. We've tried in the first thing, driving improvements in the current child protection system, to take some of the lessons that we've learnt from John Devaney's overview report, and not only John's, Marion Brandon's in England and Sharon Vincent's in Scotland, and basically pitch those all together and say, why does the plumbing and wiring in this system so frequently go wrong? Why do these basics? What is it that we can look at here and try to do something on a multi-agency basis over 3 years? The second thing, providing leadership and setting direction, in many ways that's the work of the panels which I've just referred to. The third thing, working in partnership. I said earlier on, we're not a doing organisation, we're an oversight organisation. And here's a very good example. Tony mentioned our colleagues who lead in the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership, and basically are leading in the planning, looking to actually how they can improve outcomes for children. Well, a couple of the things we want to look at are, through the partnership, are why is it that there is such a small percentage of children who are disabled on the Child Protection Register? We know from all the research that disabled children are much more likely to be subject to abuse, and yet in Northern Ireland we would have probably 30 children out of 2,100. So we want to have a look at that. We want to understand what's the reason for that. Systemically, how does that come about? Is it anything to do with practices or things that we should know? The second thing we want to look at under this heading is we want to have a look at what's called the toxic trio, which is basically mental health, drugs and alcohol, domestic violence. We have done as a system an enormous amount of work on those 3 ideas. We've worked hard at them. All the people in this room have worked hard at it. What we want to do now is actually have an annual review of each of those ideas and try and take a 360-degree perception to understand how well is the policy and procedures being implemented in practice. What are we learning? What do we learn from families? What do we learn from children? What do we learn from the front line? And finally, and I think it was John, it was probably someone else, mentioned that child protection changes. Nothing stands still. Nothing. And what we're looking at is 2 new emerging issues that are developing north of the border and undoubtedly also probably south of the border. And that's actually internet safety and child sexual exploitation. And together we have targeted those 2 ideas to try and do something about them over the coming 3 years. Now, the final point I want to say is that there could have been many, many other things that we would have targeted. But what we chose to do was basically target those things that we think no one else is doing. There's lots of work being done. Marion's leading on some work on child trafficking in the north of Ireland. We could have looked at a range of agendas, but we chose to say, if someone else is tackling this, we'll not tackle it. We may want to see oversight of what is happening, but we'll not do that. And that was the basis upon which we developed this agenda. So I hope that gives you a quick flavour of the Safeguarding Board in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.
Very much, Hugh, and I think it's very helpful that you ended with the idea of not reinventing the wheel, and certainly part of our purpose in coming here together is to avoid us reinventing wheels on either side of the border and to learn from the kind of work that's being done and collaborate on some of the work that needs to be done. I'm now going to make a very bold suggestion. We are 45 minutes behind time. So unless there's an absolute clamour from the floor, I was going to suggest we would release you and we would not have the Q&A session. Now, if people feel they want the Q&A session, I'm happy to have it. Are people okay with that? Okay, I'm getting nodding heads. Okay. Right, well then I'm going to take full advantage and I'll speak to you for 20 minutes. No, I won't. I won't. But I do think it's worth maybe just giving a few concluding remarks to be fair to our many speakers today. I think I'll go back to my 3 houses. I really like this 3 houses business. I'm going to drive my management team completely mad. But I suppose if I was to characterise some of what I've heard today about our worries, I suppose our worries are how to make, as a policy maker certainly, how to make policy that supports the needed improvements for children and children's services, and how to demonstrate the capacity and improve the capacity of the system and build confidence of the people in the system and of the people outside the system that it is doing a good job for children. And I think as a policy maker, one of the things I really heard today, you'll be glad to hear, is how to avoid undermining practice by making policies that make us all feel better, but actually are overly bureaucratic and do, as Marie said, work against honing of good, strong, professional practice and judgment. And I think that's something we really need to be mindful of. Despite all of our efforts to improve guidance and policies, we need to really bear that balance in mind. So in thinking about the strengths, I think we are all agreed on both sides of the border that the workforce we have and the experience and commitment of the people, including some of the very inspirational practitioners and managers who spoke to us here today, are certainly strengths that we can build on and that can lead change, and we know that, and we've heard some of that today. I think certainly on both sides of the border, and definitely in the south, we have changing structures and a changing corporate context, and I think that is an opportunity to take advantage of some of the political capital that is around at the moment about improving children's lives and improving services for children in a way that makes a real difference to them. I think we also have a growing network of policymakers, practitioners, academics, researchers who are all working collaboratively in a way that they weren't doing certainly 10, 15 years ago. And we really are building that up, and I hope today is another example of how that can continue to work into the future. So hopes and dreams, I'm nearly there. I think